Welcome back to Sam Explains It All, a show that helps you analyze the things you love. I'm your host, Sam, and today's episode is Eroticism, Nudity, and Pornography, an analysis of American perception of art. My co-host today is Jai-La Aponte, and she is a friend of mine who just got her master's in, it's a higher ed, but you specialized in sex education?
It's a master's in higher ed policy and student affairs, but my thesis was on sex ed.
So you've got kind of the framework for it, but then you specialized in that particular field, I imagine.
Yeah, I did a little certificate program which was about like facilitating stuff through sex ed. So that's like the sex ed credential I have that I brought into my master's program, but my actual master's is
Awesome. So I want to start this episode by kind of like talking through what exactly the psychology of sex is and why we need to talk about it and if I will link below Jayla's thesis so anyone can read through it and see exactly kind of what we're talking about, what we're touching on. But one of the big things that we need to talk about is what is sex and how do we explain it. So I'm going to start with Meg John Barker's The Psychology of Sex book, which is just a little book that gives you an idea about what the psychology of sex is happening. The first thing they talk about is how when you are doing any sexual education, you have to talk about gender, sexuality, ethnicity, cultural background, all those kinds of stuff. And you talked a little bit about that in your thesis, I believe. Do you want to touch on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So one of the main points in my thesis was that the reason sex ed isn't as successful as it could or should be in the United States specifically is because it doesn't not only address sex and gender, but all the other facets that affect all of us and our development and where we are and who we come from and who we later on become. So if sex ed doesn't include all of those different areas of identity politics, then there's really no way to have useful and helpful sex education since everyone's experience is going to be completely different. And if you don't acknowledge that and kind of know how to navigate your audience and their identities that they navigate, then that sex ed isn't going to be the most successful or useful to them. So you kind of can't have one without the other, especially in in any education, but especially sex ed.
Yeah, and I mean the bigger problem too is that, and we're already deeper than you would get at a traditional sex education. This is a broad statement. Obviously, we don't know every single person's sexual education, but the bigger picture is that most people agree that they did not receive a good sex education. So even just talking and further about gender and what that has to do with sex is important because I mean, in sexology, it's also changing a lot. I have this one quote that talks about the Kinsey scale. The Kinsey scale is based on experience rather than identity and gets a range of experiences. This is important because we get a very different statistic when we ask about sexual identity to when we ask about sexual experience. So what that's saying is that instead of asking for people to talk about what defining their sexuality, it's asking them, have you ever had a male sexual partner? Which gets a very different response then too, because we use sexuality as almost a category for people. Like you're bisexual, you're straight, but you could still be straight and still have had male sexual partners if you're a guy. And that's something that people don't talk about too. That's almost taboo to admit that kind of stuff.
Ooh, I that made me think of have you seen the whole discourse with Velma being a lesbian in the new Scooby-Doo that
Yes,
just came out?
that's like 2 days old. Oh my gosh.
And everyone was like, "Oh, but Velma was with Shaggy and they were paired." And then it was always Daphne and Freddie, but I always felt like Shaggy and Velma was forced. So like personally,
So, as someone who actually specializes in pop culture, cartoons, and comics especially, there has been a long push by creators of the Scooby-Doo franchise to really show that Velma is a lesbian. Like, this has been about 6 years in the making. So, anyone who is like, oh, they don't know anything, they haven't been watching anything in the last couple of years. They don't know what's going on, but this has been a active decision by the creators for so long. They also make her Jewish because she's had so many Jewish voice actors that they've decided that that's part of like who she is now. So, yeah,
Mhm.
but like there you can have I mean, we've all done it where you're like, do you remember being younger and being attracted to girls, but you knew you weren't really supposed to be attracted to girls, or you didn't know you could be attracted to girls? So you're like, yeah, girls are pretty, obviously. We all know that.
Oh my gosh, all the time. And then I was always like, oh, I want to be her best friend and I just want to know everything about her. But I just didn't know it was an option. So, oh my God, all the memories are like coming back.
I had the same problem. My awakening was Xena Warrior Princess. I was like, yeah, big buff women. We all love them. The other thing I wanted to, so moving from that, I also want to kind of talk about how our sex education is very heteronormative. Um, and in this book, The Psychology of Sex, they actually talk about, they call it penis and vagina, PIV intercourse, and that almost all sex advice is generally the goal is penis and vagina orgasm with the male dominating. And that is if you're taught anything in the classroom, it usually is that is the end goal, or there is an end goal to sex. It is not just fun, but there is something has to happen. And that is it's extremely toxic for anyone who's reading that because it puts a lot of pressure, and it also reinforces a very misogynistic view that the man is in control, there is a goal to it, if something has to be inserted into the woman that has an end goal of reproduction, and that is how to save a sex life. But that
Mhm.
doesn't include any queer identities. That doesn't include anyone with disabilities. That doesn't include half of the kink scene at all. And that's how most of us are taught that sex is meant to be that. And so most of our pornography, or at least the surface pornography, revolves around that kind of stereotype of the male is dominant, the female is submissive, and there is an end goal of the male coming, and then usually that's when it cuts off.
Yeah, and I think that whole statement is so limiting too, because then it like goes back to that framework where like sex is not something you do with someone, but it's something that a man does to a woman, and it just kind of reinforces that.
And I mean, if you're shoved down your throat for so long, you can become afraid. There's a ton of cases where, and actually, I've seen a bunch of episodes where it's almost a joke about a guy underperforming out of fear because he can't get it up, and that will ruin the night. Like I think there was an episode of Psych, that old TV show, where that was a plot point, and someone was so afraid that he wanted to like he was hurting himself because he was afraid he was going to underperform on his wedding night, which is very real. That is a very real thing that happens to men, is that they get so afraid that they're not going to be masculine enough, or a girl gets afraid that she won't be submissive enough, that it can, I mean, it can ruin the ability to have sex to begin with.
It's like so much more than just the finishing an act of it, but a lot of people don't realize that like what happens with sex in our bodies, it doesn't just affect like the physical, but there's also like a mental psyche, and then like it goes back to the regular health aspect. So like there isn't really any party that benefits from this whole heteronormative cisgender narrative of
Mm-hmm.
viewing sex.
And that's right at the surface. So if we're going through the timeline of people being at a certain age, usually they are I'm going to base this around my own experiences. I knew about sex before anyone explained it to me. And when sex education came around, it was just here's some gross pictures and here's like a vague description of what you shouldn't do. And then that was about it for what I experienced as like a young person, meaning that a lot of my own experiences came from firsthand or from the reading material I had. And I mean that becomes difficult because then if you're only viewing things through an artistic lens instead of an analytical lens, it becomes very hard to understand. I've read a lot of literature and they barely touch on lube, which is
Hmm.
a thing that's kind of needed during sex.
Yep, they just hack a loogie right on there, and
Yep,
that is all you see.
yep. And that's okay for an artistic lens. Like if you have enough ability to understand reality from fiction because you've been taught and you've had sex and you know what needs to happen, that's kind of like, yeah, you gloss over it, whatever. But to be the source of many young children's understanding of sex is where the problem comes in because then it's just like we're not going to talk about sex properly in the classroom, which means you need to rely on pornography, which is especially American pornography is very outlandish.
Yep, it's just a never-ending cycle because then once they start having sex and having partners, then they're gonna go ahead and try to replicate what it is they saw, and then they won't realize because they didn't have that sex education and that they went for it on the internet. It's just gonna keep creating a cycle of poor sex and poor relationships too, I think.
Mhm. And so the big topic of this is I wanted to find some words, but we have to talk about where it all starts, which is the lack of sex education. Because then, especially with America's very abstinence centered uh whatever it is, I guess it is just education again, like how we as Americans and in classrooms really shove down that you just shouldn't have sex, you shouldn't see anyone naked, you should just until you get married. And because of that, when we grow up and we start experiencing these different things and experience them through art, that is our only thing, which means that the definition, like nudity, is the same as pornography in some cases, which is very, very difficult to diverse, and that causes a lot of problems. I mean, let alone we can't take our shirt off in public.
Or that nudity is inherently sexual just from existing.
Which isn't a very is a very American viewpoint. That is other countries like you can just take your shirt off and hang out even if you have boobs, like it's fine. But
Mhm.
you can't do that in America.
Yeah, no, it's still, I feel like, a prudish society. I don't understand why, like I know in Europe, nude beaches are very popular, and like people don't super mind if you're not wearing a bra or what have you. But like the minute that someone doesn't wear one here, it's a really big problem, and it's there's just so many layers
Oh my
for
God.
nothing. For what? A nipple?
Oh my God, Jayla, I guess all listeners get to know this. I have the freaking pokiest nipples this side of the Mississippi. If I go out with a bra, everyone knows. Like I cannot get away with it, and it's terrible. 'Cause I know, and I know other people know, and it sucks.
I'm screaming. But they'll like point it out if you're not wearing a bra, but then be upset if they see your bra straps or
I
say it's
know.
inappropriate or what have you. So it's like you just can't win. And then the back problems, the support.
Oh, it's so fun not wearing a bra, and then you have to be like, sometimes it's nice because, clothing makes the outfit, but to just have that be an everyday part for no reason is so frustrating.
And also knowing that like people who have smaller chests will have an easier time going braless as opposed to someone with a bigger chest where it's a
Hmm.
problem, and even more so it's inherently sexual for someone with a bigger body type, which is a whole nother.
Yes. I mean, yeah, that's the big movement of like online people with a bigger body type, and they're constantly sexualized to try to validate their their look instead of just being like, yeah, you look pretty.
No, literally. Or they're like, no, you don't look fat. Like, I didn't say ugly.
That's a whole can of beans and how we perceive everything.
Mm-hmm.
But so moving forward, like let's again taking my own experiences. When I went to college, I was it was like all of a sudden we stopped being prudish and we were only talking about sex, especially in the English department. Like I got dropped in a bunch of classrooms and all of a sudden we were reading D.H. Lawrence and I was okay because my side hobby aside from comics is Latin American literature, which has a like of the really good ones have really like intensive sex scenes because they're very political and sex is political. But a lot of my peers were having a difficulty keeping up with this and reading it and experiencing it because it wasn't just, it was like their first time having this in a classroom and having to analyze it. Would you say, did you have to read any of that kind of stuff? And like, what would you say your experience with it was?
I feel like thinking way, way back, the first like class I ever had, I just remember getting a syllabus and seeing stuff about like the Clery Act and like sexual assault resources.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like in that instance, the first time outside of K through 12 sex ed where any sort of sex ed was brought up was when it was trauma based and about sexual assault. And then after that, it was a sex and gender course that I took that I really loved. But at least for the English department and stuff that I read, I don't think I really read a lot of erotic stories or anything, but I think I read more so things around assault and like trauma, which is
Hmm.
really interesting. Like, I don't think I remember reading anything that was just about like pleasure or exploration or the body. It had to do with trauma and the body.
Well, I mean, that also that brings up the question of what is pornography versus eroticism, which we will be getting into later. Um, because that's a big definition that's still debated in the art world is how do
Mm.
you define those two things? A lot of early books I read had to do the sex scenes. I think the best way to describe it is that the books I read personally, the sex scenes weren't hot. They were meant to convey story until I read Lady Chatterley's Lover. That one, I it used cunt to describe the actual area, not just to refer to a woman. Like they used he's like he put his penis in her cunt was how they used their words in that book. And it it did not sugarcoat anything, which is the other thing I think I've experienced with erotic literature is that it's very flowery. It's very not to the point. They don't just say what's happening. But it kind of skirts around it. So having something just be stated was a little shocking for me, but I can't imagine someone who's never had sex education or been experienced to that in a classroom being able to retain that well without it being very shocking.
No, definitely. Because I feel like it's painted as this big fantasy and that there's this big epic thing that happens, and that's why we wait for it. And it's all worth waiting for. So, like, imagine having that be your mindset and then reading something like that and having it completely shattered and, like, wait, is this what it actually is like? That wasn't my experience.
Yeah, and I mean that's also along with a lot of the narratives, there is this kind of like you have to wait because it's going to be so amazing, it's going to be sparks are going to fly and everything's going to be so right. And you know, 9 times out of 10 sex is just kind of a performance.
Mm-hmm.
You have fun, but it's not like the earth shatters around it. And that's like, if no one's heard that before, that's a very hard thing to hear or understand for the first time is that it's just another, to a degree, it's just another bodily function. Just as you go up and
Mm-hmm.
take a shower, you masturbate, you have sex.
Yep. I also think too, like a part of it is this forced emotional component to it. Like like how they bag on like femmes and women for having a bunch of partners and saying that like, oh, every partner you have, you'll be less connected to your future spouse or what have you. So I think too, like realizing that emotions don't necessarily have to be tied to it is something else that is like upsetting to people who have that mindset and like the whole glorified idea of what sex is and what you get out of it.
Well, that's also it's not a newer concept, but it's a reintroduced concept, especially in America's very puritanical view, because a lot of alternative scenes, a lot of LGBT groups are reintroducing polyamory and kind
Hmm.
of like waiting to get married and experiencing things and BDSM and kinks and stuff as a regular way to explore before you kind of like finding someone is supposed to be a romantic affair, not a sexual affair. And I've had my own experiences before I found someone romantic, and it usually was just exploration. And I have to say, the people who were the kindest were the people who were the kinkiest, because they were honest about it. They talked about it. We would sit down and have a glass of wine, and we'd be like, "What are your boundaries? Can you do this? What can I say? What can I say in the bedroom?" And it was calmer because of that. But the people who pushed my boundaries were the people who just were having regular sex, but they didn't know and they didn't talk.
I love that experience though. That's how it should be every time.
Yeah, and I think that's also a very big turning point because a lot of art is divided up into different sects. I mean, there's like academic art. There's an essay called Naked Bodies and Nasty Pictures: Decoding Sex Scripts and Pre-Adolescence Re-examining Normative Nudity Through Art Education. It's by Sheriff Bay. And in this essay, he talks about what's called the grotesque body versus the classical body. So when we're growing up, we're usually exposed to pictures of naked women. That's kind of part of the classical studies. You go to an art gallery and you see naked women all over the place, but they are poreless. They don't have any big features. They don't have, like, there's nothing to them. It's just a naked body that's as white and clear and uninteresting as a marble statue. It's supposed to be something that you look at with a lens of enamorment, but not pleasure. Um, Versus the grotesque body is anything that is not that. It usually is something that has primal needs. It needs eating, drinking, decaffeinating, urination, sex, an openness during the carnival celebration, like open bodies. Um, and so there's an aesthetic distance to the nude figure. And what I really like about this essay, this is probably one of the best essays I've read in the last 2 years, is that he goes in and talks about how he has been an art professor for years. And when you're an art professor, you have to have a figure drawing class, which means they bring in a nude model. The nude model stands around and people are supposed to draw that person. He'd been doing this for years. He had never felt any desire or anything, but they hired a girl who he didn't screen beforehand. He was busy, and she came in, and instead of undressing beforehand and putting on a robe like they usually do, she undressed in front of the class. It wasn't like a striptease or anything. She just calmly undressed. She had tattoos and stretch marks, and she had a piercings. She had nipple piercings, and I think he talks about how he she had a belly button and stuff, and he was aroused for the first time in his career because he was confronted with the grotesque body instead of the classical body. And I mean, based on your research and talking through that, obviously mine is more of an artistic side of analyzing this, but from an academic side and implementing this, like, how would you say experiencing those things in a classroom setting would affect that?
I'm like thinking back to what you're saying about like the grotesque body, and I think it goes back to like seeing something as real and in its natural state is what's the appeal to it. I mean, I don't know. I also like worked at an art school as like an admin person, so having like a little bit of background of what it is like in the classroom with nude models and students in that sense. I think it's also different too for like K through 12 and higher ed, which is like my specific niche and education background. But I think like naming it and addressing it is okay to do. Maybe like having someone on the outside who's like, if there's someone in the psych department, I think it's always okay to name what is happening. And our body reacts in natural ways, even if it's not intentional and we don't mean to have it. But I think like it reverts back to like the possibility of being ashamed or like things like that when things like that come up. But I don't know. I'm like, that was a good question. Sorry, at least like,
I think it's also a question of who gets to be nude because again, the nude women that you view in an art museum are surrounded. It's supposed to be very quiet. You're not supposed to talk. But if you're at, I mean, I go to this one tattoo parlor that's got pictures of nude women all over the place and the context is completely different. But I mean, they're technically the same pictures, and part of it is our context of viewing these things. So if you are figure drawing women who do not have defining features and all of a sudden you're confronted with this what is known as the grotesque body and you are not used to that, you're not experienced in that because no one's shown you, no one's told you, no one's had the time to go through the art an artistic lens viewing the grotesque body, it's going to be stark.
I think too, like, imagine if that was like a student's first time, like seeing a nude model and being in that setting too.
Yeah. I mean, and it's the essay, he recalls this anecdote, and it's been a couple of years since that. So this was when like tattoos were still very erotic in nature. They weren't as commonplace as they are now, and a lot of piercings, which can I just side note, how dare when we were growing up, they make us think that piercings are this almighty sexy thing that should be like is the you're a wild person if you have piercings because I've never had to be more careful in bed than when I got a lip piercing.
Oh my gosh, don't get me started, or how like the whole old narrative of like professionalism and piercings and tattoos too. Meanwhile, I have three nose rings and a full arm sleeve, and I'm still happily employed and educated.
Yeah, it's just like, oh my, I grew up and everyone be like, yeah, people have those kinds of stuff. They're so reckless and they do wild sex in bed. My partner and I have to stop because they get their hair caught in my piercing. And when I didn't have that piercing, we didn't have to think about that. We could do whatever we want. But now I'm like, no, wait, wait, you're gonna pull it. Just wait. Your hair's caught.
Oh my gosh. I can't. I feel that. Or how like, oh, those people who have those things live a dangerous lifestyle and they like live life on the wild side. Meanwhile, I wear like fuzzy socks and footy pajamas and I'm in bed by like 9 usually.
Yeah,
And pink is my favorite color.
my wild side is booking an appointment and sticking to that appointment.
I'm screaming, but only if you make that appointment from doing a phone call and not
Yes.
online.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that's my wild side is I went to an appointment to go get something done and I talked with my tattoo artist about like Ren Fair. It's so silly. But yeah, so like our experience it's weird because nudity is part of higher education, but in very specific cases, and not all nudity. Not everyone gets to be nude. If you don't fit a certain aesthetic or stereotype or appearance, you don't get to be the nude model because you stop being aesthetically pleasing and you become erotic. And of course that brings back the question like and I want your opinion before I tell you what I've been musing on this. What do you think is the difference between eroticism and pornography? If you had to define
Mm.
those words.
My initial thought was that pornography involves like a profit, and it goes back to like I think like sex work, and I think of like Playboy Bunny, and I think of things like that.
Mhm.
I don't know how I would differentiate the two. That's where my mind goes to when I hear pornography, but when I hear erotic, I think of like smutty books, and I think of like raunchy things and things that are like descriptive and real and like live like, I think.
Yeah.
That's where
So
my mind.
you and I are actually pretty close. I've been musing these words for a little bit now since I decided the title. And what I've come to the conclusion of is that I believe that Pornography has the explicit intention of getting you off, and that's all it's supposed to do. Once you're done doing that, you can close your tab, you can close the book, whatever you're doing, and you will not miss anything. While eroticism includes porn or sex scenes, but it has a bracketing story that keeps you enthralled throughout it. Is kind of how I've thought about this, because the problem that comes in, and my field of study is in comics, is that a lot of the term pornography gets thrown around a lot when it comes to comics because of its visual nature. And in defense, comics does come from sex. Like the earliest comics that we can find that were mainstream, you would go to the local bar, you'd give them a dime, and they'd hand you like a book about olive oil getting rammed by Popeye, was how comics started in the mainstream. But in Fun Home, my favorite example is it gets attributed to be pornography all the time, but I really don't think there's any book that's farther from it. Yes, there's a sex scene, but the language around it is talking about how Alison Bechdel is going into, like Odysseus is going toward the siren song and talking about her experiences with coming out as a lesbian, which involve sleeping with a woman. And you can't divorce those two. I mean, sex is part of that experience, but if you categorize it as something pornographic, which is often not academic, like I would argue that eroticism can be academic, pornography cannot be in our current choice of academic lens. You're ripping a lot of these books from their audience.
I've never actually like thought of the difference between the two. So I'm like just sitting here in it. I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense.
Well, that's the thing about, and like I said, going into comics was weird for me because I've never been confronted with sex so openly than when I started doing these studies. But it stops being, I mean, there's pornographic comics, obviously, but in the broader realm of these books, it is just part of life, and the best way to show that is through the visual medium. And so while a lot of my peers were reading different books that had to do with like uh were a little bit tamer, I was almost reading hardcore scenes with BDSM, and then the next thing would be like, and then my dad said he didn't love me, and then it would be like 80 pages about that, and then you get to another hardcore sex scene, and it's like that's just the nature of the medium. And so I was exposed to a lot of this doing my own research, and I think under the academic lens that I took, I'm better off for it, but none of my academic peers, especially from my college, could say the same for their experience. And I'll just say, because this will probably leeway into something that you can do, which if I didn't have knowledge, like sexual knowledge that I do have, that could be very difficult to understand or kind of appreciate or even read.
I was just gonna ask, since you do comics and that's kind of your mode, do you think your experience is different because your mode of art and education is both through pictures and words and dialogue?
So that's kind of the backbone of a lot of my work. And my favorite essay of all time is by this guy, Brian Grosso, who put, "I'm a Duke freshman, here's why I refuse to read Fun Home." And he cites that he won't read Fun Home because you're not to look at a woman lustfully before you're married. And then he goes to say that if it was written word, he'd be okay. But because there's pictures, he cannot read it. And I love citing that essay because it talks about the problem in academic field of how we view imagery and how it's often like we have to avoid certain images because they are pornographic because it's an image. But I could read a hardcore sex scene in my English class and we're fine. And that's also like some of the students' first exposure to these things or that language or that dialogue. And again, if that's how they're getting a lot of their information, that's a problem because it's pulling the artistic lens from that kind of stuff because that's Fun Home's not supposed to teach you how to eat a girl out, but if that's the only way that you've ever seen any depiction of eating a girl out between two women, like where are you supposed to get that other knowledge or how to do it safely or all any of that stuff?
I didn't even know what a dental dam was until college. So
That's really?
yeah, really, I had no idea what they were.
See, I was one of the boys was the problem. My first experience with pornography, I was getting on the ski club bus in middle school and someone shoved porn under my nose and they're like, "Look at this."
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, "What the fuck?"
Billy, please.
Yeah. And that I was like, that was my first experience and I knew about porn since then. And at this point, I had to unlearn a lot of stuff because I didn't have a prudish upbringing, but and my parents like they never had to talk with me, but my dad just like one day he said he's like it's okay for people to watch porn. I was like, "Thanks, Dad."
Thanks.
But like so I didn't have a prudish upbringing or anything, but I kind of policed myself until I got to high school. I was like, "Wait, that's stupid. There's so much stuff out there. Why would I police myself on something that everyone does?" And then all of a sudden like the world opened up.
That's so true. Like, I think my upbringing was similar, where like my mom was very open and like was like, we can talk, like, it's okay, like, this is this and this is that. And I was like, nope, I don't want to hear it. I'm okay. And I just like shut it down. And then once I was like old enough to like feel comfortable with it, I was like, oh, okay. Now I can talk to my mom about anything. But I think like initially I was like grossed out by my own body.
Well, and I mean, it's also the narrative that we're taught at a young age. Like, I could probably count the dozens of cartoons and movies and jokes that are made about how gross it is to know that your parents have sex. Um, and that feeds into our ability to talk to them openly. And that is also a very American thing because I was listening to a podcast and I after this I want to talk about how and you touch on this in your thesis about how a lot of exposure to sexual education is done through internet mediums and
Mhm.
how that needs to change like it's good but it needs to change to more academic fields coming in. I was listening to a podcast Ologies and Shannon Boudreau was on it who is kind of like becoming a big internet sexologist and she was talking about how if oh wait, I lost my train of thought. Oh no.
There it goes.
Oh well. Well, anyways, like that then I guess I will go right to the next point. Yeah, let's talk about the internet and its resources for learning about sex, but like the problems with it or the benefits, both. I want to talk about both. So I'm going to let you lead the charge on that.
Yeah. So, um, I both love and hate the internet for its many beautiful uses. But I'll start out with the good, I think, because I like to start on a positive note. The benefit of like having such easy access to the internet and information is that it allows people to connect more with one another. So, especially like if people are questioning or they might be curious about kink or other different things that involve sex, it's really easy for people to find a community and find people to relate to, and that can help with the feeling of loneliness and shame and isolation that they might feel from having those questions or feelings about themselves and wanting to know more about it. From the internet and the rise of sex ed content growing, especially like over COVID and going to now, there's so many good creators, I think, who do sex ed really well that I like wrote about in my paper, but also ones that I've talked with and met with personally. So, like Dr. Lindsay Doe was a really big one who I used to love just watching on YouTube. I loved her personality and her content was just amazing. And it was really cool to see like her talk about the clinical side, but also like the like personality side and just everything about sex, like she would answer, and it was great. And I actually interviewed Erica Smith for my thesis, and she is a wonderful sex educator as well who focuses on purity culture. And I just think like that wouldn't happen if the internet weren't there, and I wouldn't have met these people and gotten all this really good information that is valuable from people that are qualified to be giving this information and are experts and know what they're talking about. So, like, anyone can look them up and find their information and have sex education, because most of the time people provide that information and resources for free. So that's another component of it too, is that as long as you have internet access, which is another thing, but as long as you have access to the internet, you can pretty much access all the information you could want, as long as it's from a reliable source like them. I think the other end of that is that anyone can click post and anyone can click send and put information out on the internet and call themselves an educator and give out information that is wrong or might not be credible or isn't backed by actual fact, but by like whatever emotions or religion gets caught into that too. So you just have to make sure you're getting your information from a reliable source. But I think like that's the other end of it, is that it's not regulated online. Like I think in my thesis, I wrote about a study that focused on TikTok and talked about Planned Parenthood specifically and like their resources and content that they had. But Planned Parenthood as a like association wasn't on TikTok at the time. But I think the hashtag like sex ed or Planned Parenthood, or some hashtag was trending, but they were missing from that conversation. So it was like the person that I wanted to hear from most and the org that people wanted to hear from the most wasn't there and available to be involved in that conversation. So that conversation was being had without people who were qualified and credible to be talking about it and having those conversations. So I think it has its benefits and its downfalls. And also, like when COVID happened and there was the shutdown, it also increased the demand for like internet sex work. So I think that's
Yes.
another really cool thing about the internet and sex ed, because like camming got super popular and like different modes of sex work increased, and that also made it safer for sex workers themselves
Yes.
who didn't have to like go out during a pandemic and endanger themselves and their health to make a living and do the work. So I think like that's another end of it too, where like it became a safer environment once that demand ended up increasing.
Hmm.
So yeah.
I can absolutely agree with all of that because, I mean, and my field of study, the bigger problem too is that comics are largely owned at this point, not completely, but like independent comics are largely run by women and notably queer women. Um, and so you get a lot of differing viewpoints and you get a lot of open and honest discussions about sexuality and all of that. But the problem that I run into, and I'm curious to see how this will bleed into your field, is that if people are not trained or they're not properly educated beforehand, it becomes very hard to divorce reality from fiction. And so there are rape scenes in books all the time, and 9 times out of 10 there is, and unless it's like a very particular book, usually there's a purpose to it. Like
Mhm.
there is something in the story that is delivered to it. And I mean, there is pornography with that kind of stuff in it. Um, but the key thing here is that a book does not need to consent with you. You are just consuming it. But the inability to divorce the fiction from reality is where the problem then comes in. And I think it has to do with our lack of sex education.
Yeah, I think it all just goes back to the sex ed and the whole idea of a fantasy, because if something is marketed as a certain way or this is a certain reality and then you have no way to differentiate from what you've been told, so what you've been told is truth, it's just like a never ending thing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also that we don't have very open discussions about those things. And in Meg and John Baker's book, they talk about how they would talk through, they people would come forward and say that they have a pornography addiction. or they have a sex addiction. And they'd kind of talk through it and they'd be like, why do you think that it's an addiction? What do you think is going on? Uh, and usually it came back that like one, either society made them think they had an addiction, that they were having too much sex, or that there was something about it that was making them uncomfortable. And when instead of just pushing away and like talking through it, like this one guy, he he liked having role play conversations where he was submissive and he was uncomfortable about that. And when he talked through it, he realized he did want to be put in those situations because he's so stressed all the time that the thought of giving up control was very attractive to him. And so, like, once he learned that that was the root of it, it became like, okay, you don't have to go crazy, but like, you could relax or let someone else lead or you can talk through it. But if you never talk about those things, you're never going to know.
I'm telling you, all it takes sometimes, not always, is just a discussion or like, hey, do you ever feel like this?
Yes. And just being honest with it. And
Mhm.
so I actually pulled, and I wanted to pull this because the other thing is that pornography and fandom can also not be separated because I don't know if you knew this fact, but 50 Shades of Grey was originally Twilight fan fiction.
Ooh, that I did know. I
Yes.
love that fact.
And fandom and pornography have been interlinked for years. Like I said, some of the first comics were Popeye pornography. It
Mhm.
there's no separating those. So I pulled the most popular tags from AO3 and I want to read them and then I want to compare them to the most viewed Pornhub stuff. Because fandom usually is dominated by queer females, is mainly where fan fiction is targeted to. That's not completely, versus Pornhub is usually through more of a male gaze. Do you think, would you agree on that, just like vaguely?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think like women and AFAB people like need that backstory and need to feel like emotionally aroused, where men don't really need that. They just kind of like the visual, I think.
Yes. So the most popular tags from 2022, this was sourced by Batcat229, and this is an actual thing on AO3. You can just look it up, and they list out every year the top tags, the list where things go and where they come from. I'm just going to list off like the first couple. It's at number 4, it's sexual content. At number 6, it's sex. At number 10, it's smut. At number 18, it's oral sex. At number 26 is BDSM. At number 33, anal. At number 36, porn. At number 42, anal sex. Number 53, bottoming. 55, finger fucking. And so, like, these are tags that, first of all, let you know exactly what's going on because this is a wider space, which means that you can properly catalog and tag things. Um, but it also kind of it narrows the action of what's happening. So you know what's going on, you know what to expect going into it. Comparing
Mhm.
that to the Pornhub list, I'm gonna list like I guess the first 10. Um, Japanese, lesbian, ebony, hentai, milf, anal, mature, amateur, popular with women, threesome. Most of those are people, not actions. So you are viewing, and I guess the difference is that AO3 is you're going in knowing the characters, you know what they look like, so you don't really have to explain a type, but there is more of a focus on the act and what's happening during the sex than the people that you're viewing, which is where Pornhub gets a lot of their thing. Like the first thing being Japanese means that you are looking for that imagery versus the first thing being number 4 or let's say oral sex, which is the first act. You're going in, you're like, oh, okay, there's this thing's going to happen and this is an act, it's not a person. And I mean, that's part of the gaze too, the erotic versus the pornography is that a lot of times in pornography, the objectification of these people is a big problem.
Like I think it's also a mix of like objectifying and also fetishizing.
Yes.
Because I see like lesbian was like number two, which
Yep.
is like another identity, and we have Japanese. So it's like not only are we treating these as objects, but also like creating like a fetish out of it.
Yes. And I mean, that's also a problem too, where if you're not honest about pornography being a thing, you're not honest about these are things that people view, you can't talk about the problems with them because there is a huge Orientalism problem when it comes to porn and comics, especially. Like, there's so much fetishizing of um, Arab outfits and things that don't actually exist. And if you can't just be like, hey, you read porn? Cool. There's a problem. There's a big problem in it. But if you can't even admit that, you can't talk about it.
Nope. Mm-mm.
And I want to and there's good stuff too, like on the internet. Like you were talking about the researchers, a big comic that came out that's been running since like 2014 is called Oh Joy Sex Toy, which is just a bunch of authors going in and reviewing sex toys and how to use them properly, and it shows visuals and what they do, and it kind of explains them in a very like comedic way. So it gets the point across, but there's very little guides on how to use these kinds of objects that aren't just, pulling up porn.
Yep. You got to look at the little manual sometimes, and the text is really small, so a visual is
Yes.
always helpful, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Especially on the more like the kinkier you get and the different stuff that they use. Like I think the one that stuck with me is that they had a machine, like one of those actual setup fuck machines, and those look scary to set up if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah. Imagine like a wrong screw too somewhere.
Yes, like that's a little unnerving. And there's so much to that. The other thing too is that there are resources out there for sex. Like I picked up a ton of Playboy magazines at a farmer's market a year ago. And one of the things that I found interesting is how very little pornography is actually in the magazines. There's like a lot of written content. They're reviewing music, they're reviewing movies, they're telling you which ones are good, which ones are bad. There's the middle spread, yes, which is just naked women. And there is a very much a problem about how they objectify the females, but there was also a columns about advice, different positions. The history of oral sex was in one of them and explained how it started, where it was going, why it became so popular. But the one that I found very interesting was in the Playboy April 2001 edition. It was called Pure Love Preposterous: What Happens When Church and State Design a Sex Ed Course, and it was written by James A. Peterson. And he's got this fun line in it. I love it. The course claims he's talking about a couple of courses that are being debated for the classroom. And the one that he talks about, he says the course claims to be the first and only curriculum built exclusively around the abstinence-only guidelines put forth by the U.S. government. The authors of these new facts of life boast that it is not a sex education program and that no graphic sexual images will be shown in class. When you take the sex out of sex education, what is left? Clearly not education. And that was in a Playboy magazine with a middle spread. But it honestly talked about what was happening, what was politically happening to sex and how we view it. And there is such a stigma against Playboy in general that this kind of material will be negated completely, that there is, to a degree, a certain very progressive viewpoint in it. Now, that being said, everything has its flip side. There are problems with Playboy magazines, but it's not like it's just purely pornography like we're all thought that it is. They were trying to convey stuff and teach and do things with very limited resources.
Hmm. Especially like for 2001, this was put out.
Yes.
For 2001, that's pretty progressive.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, this wasn't a magazine that I thought was just a bunch of lewd images. There was so much more in it. And to actually talk about that and be like, hey, this might actually be a pretty good resource. It's like the Kama Sutra. I've been talking to so many people recently doing the research for this, and they've honestly asked me, they're like, how do I get better at sex? I'm like, have you read the Kama Sutra? And they're like, they laugh at me. I'm like, no, I'm actually very serious. That book is written so that anyone can find a position that works for them. And it explains how someone who is like a smaller guy with a bigger girl or a bigger guy with a smaller girl, like how you can fit in different scenarios, and explains it and shows body things. Like it's not a sexy book, it's an informative book.
I was gonna say, I just got like a flashback memory of me like going into my mom's closet and like finding books that were like informative on like positions and like things like that, and like that memory just popped up in my head. Ah,
Yep. I remember my first experience with the Kama Sutra was someone had downloaded it on their iPod. Yeah, I think it was the original iPod
the
Touch.
shuffle or the touch.
I think whatever it was, but they had it, and we were like joking and laughing, like ah ha ha, sex positions or whatever. Um, and years down the line, when I was reading the 1001 Arabian Nights, I for some reason I pulled up the Kama Sutra halfway through. I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually like this is not sexy. It's just still images, and they're not explaining anything. They're like, this is how you do this so that this certain amount of pleasure can be obtained. And that's informative and should be talked about. And it's just not, because we refuse as a society, as an American society, we refuse to distinguish those kinds of things because it just all falls under the title of pornography. No separation between informative, nudity, eroticism, like anything.
And it's like people should be able to have access to information that helps explain how their body works and how to like best explore it.
Mm-hmm. And there's sources, but they're also hard to find if you don't know where to look. Ojoy Sex Toy has a deal with a group. I forget the name of it. But their whole thing is that they're actually kind of teaching you through scientific terms how best for women to masturbate. And they explain like if you press this part of your body, it actually feels good in this way, and they explain why and everything. And it's very like it's showing people masturbating, but it's very tame and academic in its approach. But you find that by pursuing a webcomic about sex toy reviews, that if you're not down that line of thought, you're never gonna find it. And I think we're getting to the back half here, which is where I want to. So if we were to we're talking about higher education, and we want to implement eroticism, pornography, what have you, into the classroom. Where do you think it should, not necessarily where do you think it should go, but how should the dialogue be changed from what it is right now?
I think like the kind of same way where we started like this episode off with definition and just naming things.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when I think of like new students who are coming into college and who may be openly talking about sex for the first time, they might not even know there's a difference between all of these different phrases and words and what it means and what it has to do with them and their lived experience in their body. So I think like the best way to like start it off would just be to open up that conversation as early as possible. I know like I have a background in like working orientation, and they usually have some sort of sex ed skit or information session with just the students after they move in. So that's where I would like envision something like this going, and a conversation and a dialogue like this, but
Mm-hmm.
also knowing that like something in the classroom with not a huge lecture hall can be less intimidating than like a huge orientation group talking about sex where everyone's going to be laughing, giggling, and people
Yep.
might not want to ask questions. So I like can see like an intro maybe happening like at that point, and then a further conversation happening down the line, like in individual classrooms or at events or anything like that. But I
I
think it all just really starts with naming it. I think most of the confusion would dissipate or like be maybe having more explanation if things are just named and talked about.
I could agree with that. And I also think that the thing is, too, is that a lot of fields do have the chance to talk about this, and they elect to kind of brush around it. So, my two fields of study are English and theater. And in English, we read a ton of books about sex. and we kind of talk about it, but from a very literary standpoint. And then in theater, you learn intimacy direction, which is a newer thing where they actually have people train to come in and make it so that's kissing scenes, sex scenes, holding scenes, fight scenes. Everyone is consenting and comfortable and it goes smoothly, which in both instances, those are the times to talk about these kinds of things. But in both instances, in my experience, we didn't really talk about them outside of their artistic lens. So there was no real world application to any of these things. And I mean, from your departments, I assume you've talked about these things. Would you kind of concur that they didn't really go any deeper?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like, after that first, like, discussion where everyone's in a big room, the only time you ever get any more information about sex would be, like, at an event or, like, sex toy bingo.
Yep.
But other than that, there's nothing really where you're, like, getting information and retaining it because it's kind of just like, "Here's this information, um, you're living on your own for the first time, and there's a bunch of other people here, and figure it out, and, like, here's what this is." So,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, like, just not accessible, and it's not prominent and there as often as it should be, which is why the whole base of my thesis was born, because I think that this is something that just needs to be around, not just for orientation, not just in one class that talks about, like, sex or gender or sexuality or an event. It's something that needs to be accessible to all students throughout their whole journey of school, really. It doesn't stop after their first year of college or even after they graduate. Like, people are still going to be discovering themselves and learning new things well into adulthood until, the end of time. There's people who come out like in their 70s and 80s and transition and what have you. So it's just a constant journey. So it doesn't make sense why sex ed would only happen at this one point when you're starting college and this specific journey.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with all of that because there is kind of a stilting around these subjects or it's viewed from a particular lens or it's kind of like there's always something about it. It's almost like it's never talked openly or in a way that people will kind of ask or retain information. And it could be something as simple as like use more lube or here's how to like wash properly after everything's done. Like that kind of stuff is really, really important. And you're not going to get that from art. You're not going to get that from a theater. You're going to get that from educating people. And I think that also bleeds into my field of study because being able to separate yourself from these kinds of image and view it from an objective lens while still retaining your own grounding on information is what actually allows these things to be properly discussed in the classroom. Because you're not going to hear people throwing out anecdotes in the classroom, but almost all of good literature is built on people's own experiences.
And like humans just have this inherent need to make connections with one another too. So I think like if we just find connections between one another, it'll just be an easier process as a whole too.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem in American sex and art and everything is that we're not very honest. We're not very open. We're very closed off and kind of prude about all of this kind of stuff. And it really needs to change because it's not going away. That's how we keep getting people. So there has to be an open, honest discussion because a lot of other nations are doing it.
I also think like I'm seeing a shift and like I'm seeing more people like around our age and younger like ask more questions and start vocalizing their needs and their want for more education like this too. So I'm hoping that like eventually soon enough we'll be closer to what other countries are doing and their sex education and everything around that. But it is nice to see that people are starting to like speak up now, at least from what I've been seeing. I don't know if you've been seeing the same thing on your end, but I definitely see more students asking for information about it and not feeling as ashamed about it as you or I may have felt like years ago.
Yeah, I can agree. It's almost like there's a pull and push because there's a lot of laws that go into place every single year that are trying to limit these kinds of things from the viewpoint of protecting children. Um, that go into place every year, which then like lack of exposure is a problem. But then like people are being more academic about it. Like a lot of sexologists did get very popular during the pandemic. They got their stations. They started talking honestly about, I mean, that's how I learned about the term free relationship, which changed how I viewed my own relationship. And I knew I came out as bisexual when I was 14. Like I've kind of known myself for a while. So to be confronted with something I didn't know was astounding for me. But it was nice that people are being honest and exploring and talking through this kind of stuff. But I feel like there needs to be from from the older generation, there needs to be a step back. That there needs to be an honesty and like, yes, we want to protect people, but we protect them by educating them, not limiting them. Because it didn't
Mhm.
work on I mean, it worked on our generation. We all figured it out. But half of us, like our age group and people above us, it was hard. And most of us got sexually abused because of it. Like there just needs to be a change in dialogue. And I really like, I'm going to quote you because I love this line you have in your essay. You say about this will transform passive allyship to action-oriented activism rooted in centering the experiences of sexual minorities who are erased from sex education, queer and transgender identities, individuals with intellectual and or physical disabilities, individuals with sexual trauma, Black, Indigenous people of color, those who experience poverty, and sex workers. That those words, passive allyship to action-oriented activism, is so good because that's exactly what's happening is people find out stuff and you're like, hey, good for you. Maybe we could talk about this further instead of being like, okay, this is going to happen. These are things that happen. Let's talk about it. Let's work through it.
Yeah, definitely. I think like too, once I started learning more about like what it meant to differentiate allyship and activism, that kind of shaped my research and things that I believe in when it comes to like advocating for other individuals. Because I feel like you can say you support all you want, but if there's nothing concrete that can support these students and these people with these identities, then there's nothing really that's going to happen. There's no actual change that's going to happen because you can support and support and support. But if there's no resources or there's anything else that is there to support in a concrete way that is more than just offering a hand, like acceptance, then there's nothing really for that support and all that to go.
Mhm. Yep. I mean, and I'm curious how your experience is, but we're going to be signing off soon, but I want to end with this. I'm curious how your experiences with sex changed when doing this research, just like how you viewed it and talked to people. Because I know having done this research for this episode, my stuff changed completely, but I'm curious how yours went first.
It definitely like opened my eyes to things that I kind of knew were my own reality, and seeing that like my own reality was backed up in the research that I was finding was like really interesting and also like comforting in a way where it's like at least I know like I'm not alone in my experiences. And also like I think I was the first person in my cohort, or no, I was the first or second person in like my program to do a thesis on sex education. So it's just something that isn't really talked about like in higher ed specifically. So that was also like a unique challenge, and something to navigate because everyone else did different things about like supporting international students or like supporting this population of students or conduct or the different areas of higher ed, which are also really cool and interesting. But I think like I continue to learn more about myself like as a 24-year-old as opposed to like me when I was 19 and I learned that I was bi, and like how that has changed and shifted with my research. I feel like I've grown with it, and it's just really cool to see things go full circle where like back in my freshman and sophomore year, like being scared and being nervous and not really knowing like who I was or like why I was having these feelings towards people that weren't men, to like someone now who's like, yeah, I put the word orgasm in the title of my thesis, and I'm going to say it in front of every single person, and I'm going to announce this topic because it's something that's important to me. And I'm going to grab your attention because I want you to remember that like this affects you too, even if you don't directly think it does. It affects you or someone you love. And it was also funny too because I had to do a defense. So we would do our defense and talk for what our research was, and then we had like professors there ready to like ask us questions. Neither of my chairs people asked me questions. I had all audience questions when I was doing my thesis defense,
Wow.
which was so interesting and fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So I will always remember like that's who I do it for. Like I do it for people who are listening and people who want to learn. Obviously, I did it to get my degree, but like this wasn't just for me. This was for like the people who were me years ago asking questions and like being nervous and like trying to find the words for the things that they need.
Hmm. I love that because that's such a noble. It's so noble of a transition. Mine, honestly, is a little bit cruder. But I think it's interesting to compare our two experiences because I've always been very honest and open about my sexual life in a very kind of promiscuous way, almost as a backlash to how people never talk about it. And doing this research, I switched to a kind of more just relaxed way of talking about it. Instead of being almost like aggressively sexual to, I guess, almost prove a point, or not even prove a point, just get sex to be in the conversation. I like it became a little bit easier. It came a little bit more academic for me. I was closing up one night, and this guy I was talking to who was drinking some whiskey, he's like, "Oh, so well, what's your new research?" And I explained what I was doing. He's like, "Oh, ha ha ha." I'm like, "No, I'm serious because, there's not a lot, I mean, like, for example, if you rub the back of your hand, that's as many nerve endings that are in the female vagina. So, foreplay's important."
Mm-hmm.
And it opened up a very casual, honest dialogue with a guy that I usually don't get very often. And it was nice. It shifted my aggressive kind of stance to a more like a little bit more of a laid back stance, which was, it's been wonderful. It's been so much easier to talk about this now, and I feel like being able to talk about sex with people has been, it's like a weight is off my shoulders now.
Yeah. I love that our experiences are so different, but like there's growth.
Yes. It leads to about the same thing, which is trying to educate people on these things and have honest, open dialogues about them. Um, and I think with that, we're about done. So, Jai-La, do you have any last things you want to add for the audience?
Um, what do I even think to say? Sex is cool and everyone should talk about it more, I think. And I think we should never stop being curious.
That that was an amazing sign off. I'm not even going to add anything because it was wonderful. This has been Sam Explains It All. Thank you, Jai-La, so much for being on with me. You can follow me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. So just check me out. Feel free to talk with me. Jai-La stuff is going to be listed below, so absolutely check her out. She did an amazing job with her thesis. It was so fun to read. And I'll see you all next time. Have a wonderful rest of your whenever until I see you all again.